Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Today I'd like to discuss a very important question. The question is, why is it that so many classical scholars and scholars of the past include weak hadith in their books, whilst on the contrary, the modern scholars include only authentic narrations in their books? And I think the issue here is that many assume that the modern contemporary scholars are actually stronger in hadith than the past classical scholars. So, for example, somebody will pick up a book by a classical scholar, maybe Ibn Qayyim, Al Ghazali, Ibn Qudama, and then they'll look at the hadith that are brought, they'll look into the footnote, and it says, considered weak by Shaykh Al Albani. So then they say, wait a minute, how is it that Ibn Qayyim or Al Ghazali didn't know that this hadith is weak? And Albani had to come later and correct them. Many people believe this. They say, look, Sahih Abu Dawood, written by Shaykh al-Albani. This means Abu Dawood wasn't strong in hadith. He had weaker hadith in his books. Albani had to come and gather the authentic narrations because he was stronger in hadith. Now, I'm using Shaykh al-Albani as an example because many people turn to him on these issues. But other contemporary scholars as well, you name them, Shaykh ibn Baz, Shaykh al-Fawzan, Shaykh al-Uthaymeen, and you find that the majority of their narrations might be from Sahih al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim, or they are authenticated, etc. So many may ask, why is this the case? Are the modern scholars stronger in hadith than the classical scholars? So I would say that this is somewhat of a misconception, and that there are clear reasons why classical scholars include weak hadith in their books. So since this issue is confusing for many, I'm going to try and clarify it, inshallah ta'ala. So what should be understood regarding the ruling on a hadith, meaning whether it's authentic or weak, etc., is that it's an ijtihad, meaning based on scholarly independent research. And here on screen we have the article of Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Khudair, who says that some ahadith are authentic according to all the scholars, and some ahadith are considered weak according to all the scholars. But there is a third category where some ahadith are considered authentic by some scholars and weak by other scholars. Hence, in the study of some ahadith, their research has led them to different conclusions. The second point is that many of the past scholars permitted narrating weak ahadith pertaining to fada'ilul a'mal, meaning virtuous deeds or virtuous acts. And this can be found in the statements of Al-Imam Ahmad, for example, who says that many of the Ahlul Hadith were not too strict on narrating weak hadith pertaining to dua and good deeds, with conditions of course, so no liar or fabricator can be in the chain, for example. So not just any weak hadith is accepted in this. And many scholars say that this is the opinion of the majority of the past scholars. As for many of the modern scholars, they seem to be much more strict when it comes to this, and this can be for various reasons, such as the abundance of ignorance in our era, etc. And note that this is pertaining to fada'ilul a'mal and not ahkam, which are legal rulings. Why? Because this is linked to halal and haram, which is a big deal, which can change the daily life of a person. So it's not something to play with, hence many of these scholars were stricter when it came to legal rulings. The third point is that many of the past scholars, in the way they wrote their books, they would present authentic evidences first on a certain issue, such as an ayah of the Quran, such as an authentic hadith, and then they would back that up and support that with weaker narrations. And you can see here in his book Al-Istighatha, Ibn Taymiyyah has statements to this effect. And one of the best examples that comes to mind for this is the famous book Kitab al-Tawheed by Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, where he is known for starting a chapter with an ayah, for example, or an authentic hadith, and then he may back that up with weaker narrations as supporting evidence, not as the main evidence. And you have some people who criticize Kitab al-Tawheed for having weak narrations, but clearly they miss the point. The fourth point is that for many of the past scholars, it was all about being on the safer side and preferring weak narrations over qiyas and opinion and logic, etc. And I think the problem for many people is that when they hear weak narration or weak hadith, they automatically assume that it's fabricated, or they automatically link that to fabrication. Whereas, no, a weak hadith, there's still a chance it's correct from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's just that it's a lesser chance and a lesser probability. It's like having a friend telling you stories and you know he's unreliable. But unless he's a straight up liar and fabricator, you'll always say, okay, there's a chance that his story is correct, even though it's a smaller chance. So we have to differentiate between a weak hadith and a fabricated hadith. And hence, many of the past scholars, including the four Imams, gave value to weak narrations, especially if there was nothing authentic to contradict them, and based on some conditions as well, such as no liar being in the chain and no fabricator, etc. The fifth point is that many of the earlier scholars considered using weak narrations if they were in line with the opinions and actions of the Sahaba or of some of the Sahaba. And on this point, many of the modern scholars are particularly strict, preferring to stick only to the Nas, the clear, authentic text, as they consider that to be safer and more cautious. But some earlier scholars saw it differently, and in this example, Imam al-Tirmidhi attaches importance to the fact that a certain hadith is backed up by the actions of the companions radiallahu anhum. So this methodology was present in many of the earlier scholars, and here we have al-Bayhaqi stating that if a mursal hadith, which is a type of weak hadith, is supported by the opinion of a companion, then this would be considered evidence by Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah. And in another statement, Imam al-Bayhaqi says the same regarding a munqati' hadith, which is another type of weak hadith. And he says that if it's supported by the opinions of companions, then it may be used as evidence. Point number 6 is that different books have different methodologies and conditions. And this goes back to the introduction of books. Many people, when they read a book, they don't really care about the introduction, whereas in general, the introduction will tell you all you need to know regarding how the book was written. A great example of this is the letter of Imam Abu Dawud to the people of Mecca, where he explains the methodology of his book Sunan Abi Dawud. So in this letter, Imam Abu Dawud clearly states that yes, his Sunan actually does have weak narrations, but he makes it clear that he put them there for a reason and that he knows what he's doing. And this is the case for so many of the earlier scholars. When they brought weak narrations in their books, it was because there was a reason or a point to it, and they knew what they were doing. And it's not because they were weak in the science of hadith or have less knowledge than the modern scholars. The final point is that some scholars say that there are differences in the minor details of hadith methodology between the earlier scholars and the later scholars. And this may lead to different conclusions on the ruling of a hadith. And this can already be seen between earlier Salaf and later scholars, such as Al-Hakim and Naysaburi. We can see in his book Al-Mustadrak that he has a slightly different hadith methodology than many of the scholars that came before him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.